Hello, and welcome to everyone here who's joining us for this webinar on the road to COP26. We have a wonderful hour of fun conversation, content, and some time for questions. And Dr. Mary Johnstone-Louis and I are really excited for this discussion. So we're just going to wait a few minutes. We always know that people sometimes running between meetings need a little bit of time to reset before joining. Although, Mary, look, the numbers are climbing rapidly here as people are coming in. Excellent.
Very exciting, but not surprising given where we are in the calendar and the run up to COP and the nature of these discussions and how relevant they are, I think, to our alumni at the school, to the various programs of people who come from all different parts of Said Business School and beyond. So yeah, I'm delighted to see everyone here. Welcome for wherever you are in the world joining us today.
Truly, it is a moment that matters. And it, as you say, Mary, should be no surprise that we have a ton of people with links to Oxford joining us. For those of you who are on the line and joining us right now, again, we're going to give people a couple of minutes to just kind of get in and get comfortable and settled. What I'd love to do is ask any of you who are on the line right now to please, if you've got any questions that you want to make sure we try to cover over the course of this hour together, I'd like to ask you to please put those in the Q&A section. So this is a really genuine invitation where what we really want to know is how we can best use this time to cover the things that are on your mind as it relates to COP26. So again, we've got an incredible team working with us today that are going to be capturing sort of common themes in that questions box and making sure, again, that we have some time towards the end of our session to address them. So again, if you're coming into this call today with a few specific things or more general areas that you want to make sure we cover and explore, please use that question box and we will be monitoring it and doing our very best to pick up on the key questions that are in the room right now, in the Zoom room, as we should say. Great. Well, I think we should kick off. It looks like we've got a good number of people that are here with us already. Hello and welcome. My name is Charmian Love, and I'm the entrepreneur in residence at the Said Business School with an affiliation with the School Center for Social Entrepreneurship. I also have the great pleasure of being the program director of the Oxford Climate Emergency Program. And today I'm joined by Dr. Mary Johnstone-Louis, who is a senior research fellow at Said Business School and has worked with more than 700 participants since last year on the school's leading sustainable corporations program. Mary, I'm so glad you're here. And I know there's a real interest in making sure we are creating strong connections by those who are in the program that you're across with leading sustainable corporations and those that are joining from the Oxford Climate Emergency Program, which, as those of you who are on the line that know, is a joint initiative between the Said Business School and the Smith School. So it's great. I'm hoping we're going to see some more of these questions coming through. Some of those of you will have seen on the invitation that we did have another speaker that was going to be with us today, and that is Dr. Aoife Brophy, who is my co-program director at the Oxford Climate Emergency Program. Sadly, due to an illness, she is unable to join us today. But what we'd ask for you to do is, if you have specific questions, if you sort of read Aoife's bio in advance and we're really looking forward to asking her something specific about her research, please make sure you identify that in your questions in the questions box, and we will do our very best to try and get answers for you. But as I'm sure everybody understands, we are still in quite complicated times, and we all wish Aoife the very best for a speedy recovery. With that, I think let's get tucked into the content for today. I think what unites all of us on the call here is a recognition, as we've said in sort of framing of today, that this is a moment that really matters. And you obviously have an interest in the conversation that needs to happen as it relates to the climate emergency. So again, we are very excited and glad to have you on the line. We hope that along with your interest is a very clear desire to find ways to take action, which is going to be something we really want to make sure we have time to address on this in our call today. Now, as you probably know, this is an area that Oxford University has been engaged in and is providing leadership in many different parts of the school. We'll be reflecting on some of those areas in our conversation today, but I'd like to give a shout out to the amazing folks that are working at Oxford Net Zero. And if you're interested in more in specifically the net zero journeys that businesses and governments and city regions are on, please definitely check out Oxford Net Zero. Of course, we have programs like Leading Sustainable Corporations and the Oxford Oxford Climate Emergency Program, and also just a huge wide breadth of incredible research that's happening across the school. So we realize that today we are only going to be touching on a very, very tip of an iceberg here of tons of research and, again, really important material that's being developed at the university. Where possible, we will try to signpost you to other areas that reflect the areas you have an interest in. But again, this is a great moment for us at the University of Oxford to be able to at least shine a light on some of the exciting things that are happening. Okay, with, of course, COP26 only being about 3 weeks away. I don't know about you, Mary, but I'm certainly feeling a little bit of a tick-tock in the background as the alarm clock and the countdown is really on. So again, we're going to really make sure that over this time, we're going to try and cover a few things that I think everybody should have in mind as it relates to this countdown to COP26. And what we'll be doing is sharing a briefing where what we've got is some information that has actually come in from the COP26 team, and we'll be presenting it to you. So this is material coming straight from the people that are in those positions of planning for the big conference of parties in Glasgow. And then what we'll be doing is just sharing a few reflections on some of this briefing material that we think will be relevant and important for you to have in mind. And then finally, we're going to be ending with some ideas and specific ways in which, if you are interested in engaging more deeply in what's happening for COP26, we have a few ways for you to be able to track this and even within your own organization, find ways to engage. Mary, anything that you'd like to add before we get going here?
Thanks so much, Char. There's so much to share here. And I think the big picture for this conversation is, we have a huge number of you dialed in today to have this conversation, and you're having this conversation in a forum that is hosted by a business school. And World Conference of Parties and the COP process is about policy, it's about political discussions, it's about political agreement. The role of business is fundamental. And I think that's what we are most excited to really dive into today. And so I hope for each of you who have made the time to join us, you're coming with that hat on of thinking about what is the role of business and how can business move quickly and with the kind of urgency and innovation and real fundamental change that's required to get the changes that will be discussed in great detail at COP26. So really excited to be here. And just for those who like a bit of background reading, I'm going to recommend a book, which is a book named From Heresy to Dogma. It's actually a classic text. And so if you haven't read a lot about the history of the corporate environmental movement, of the push and pull, of the way that corporations have either blocked or led or innovated or fallen behind within the fight to save our natural resources and the earth that we all call home, Andrew J. Hoffman is the scholar who wrote this book called From Heresy to Dogma, now many decades back, and it's worth a read. I think all of us who are interested in these issues can just pick up a copy, dust it off, and look at what this set of arguments is, which is really a question about how does something move from something that feels tangential to business, feels secondary, feels like something that business can perhaps put off until the next quarter, the next year, the next decade, or never at all, to front and center. So how does it move to front and center of the strategic frame? And I think that is really the question that we want to discuss today, is how do these issues move to the front and center of what business is there to do? And what is the context in which that's happening right now with the COP26 process? So there you go. Hope that's a useful read for all of you. If you don't know that history, it's a really engaging and brings us a lot of lessons that we can carry forward with urgency right now.
Excellent. And maybe what we can do is make sure that you have a reference to that book in the chat so that people can see and be able to follow through on their interest in sort of engaging in that material. So thank you so much, Mary. I also just want to acknowledge we've already got 2 questions coming in, so I'm just going to say them out loud so we all know that these are some of the threads that are already part of our conversation today. Chris, you're saying food waste, if it was a country, would be the 3rd largest emitter of carbon in the world. Why do you think food waste isn't on the agenda for COP? Good question. Let's see if we can sort of address that as we go through the COP26 briefing materials. And David, you're saying what actions are recommended for us to take to ensure our politicians take action at the COP26 rather than make more well-intentioned statements? David, great question. And I think we can absolutely reflect on that a little bit. One of the areas of reflection I'm really interested in bringing into the conversation as we go through is the role of movements and citizen movements that are out there, again, trying to really make sure that there is deep meaning associated with these commitments that are being made. And as Mary said, this is a time for action. I think that is going to be one of the threads and themes that will be very highly reflected in the meeting. Great. Okay. Oh, no more open questions. Ryan, actually, I'm going to ask if you might just put those questions back, because I know we've addressed them and put them out there, but I think we want to make sure we capture them so we can spend some time discussing them later. And yes, okay, I see some other thing here about Oxford Net Zero Initiative and how people not part of Oxford University can engage. Great. Please, if we will just make sure we get all those questions still in, keep them flowing through, and we will try and address them as best we can as we go through. All right, my friends, buckle up, because what I'm going to try and do in the next sort of 10 minutes or so is go through what materials would have been shared with us from the COP26 team when we sort of said that we would be doing this briefing. They shared a few things that they thought would be really important for people with this sort of affiliation with Oxford to have in mind on the road to COP26. Now, there is a lot of material, as you can imagine, and what I've tried to do is put it into 3 slides. So we're going to kind of go for this. I am going to apologize if I start speaking too quickly. Mary, maybe you can kind of like get me to slow down, because I get really excited about this. And I know
hold your hand.
Yeah, I'll hold up the hand for sure. All right, so maybe if we could go to the first slide, first of our 10 rapid 3 slides in 10 minutes. There we go. So we thought we'd start by setting the scene. So the road to COP26. What is going on and why is this such an important moment? Well, it starts with there really is an increased sense of urgency. Some of you will have seen the IPCC's 6th assessment report that just came out, which I think the headlines that we probably are all feeling right now is that there is a need for greater immediate action right now to keep us at 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is what the Paris Agreement has assigned for us. And that is what we have committed to. The language that has been used to underpin this urgency is language such as code red. So if anyone wants to know more about the IPCC and what's in it and why it is so meaningful, I actually will point you to a wonderful podcast called Outrage and Optimism with Christiana Figueres, who's sort of the architect of the Paris Agreement, in conversation with Michael Mann. And they do a really sensational summary of why this IPCC report is so critical and important, and again, underpins this urgency we need. I think one of the references was, if climate scientists could scream from the rooftop, this is what that IPCC looks like, is this moment of we all need to step up and step up quickly. And I think that kind of connects to the second piece under this kind of category of increased urgency, is recognizing that we have set these incredibly bold targets linked to the Paris Agreement, and we are far from meeting them. So again, this is requiring us all to find ways to really, really step up and take action, recognizing that we are in this incredibly critical moment. Now, there's also a piece here that's around recognizing that we are seeing a growing political ambition around engaging on these important topics. So in 2021, what we saw was real momentum. We saw major economies, including the US, Japan, the UK, and EU, substantially increasing the level of their commitments to addressing this emergency. So it is important to know that we do have some good wins in our sails because we are seeing a real shift in momentum and recognizing people really do want to step up. Another connected point to this growing political ambition is actually linked to the G7. The G7 signaled its support for mandatory climate risk reporting for companies in line with the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures, so the TCFD, as some of you may know it. We're also seeing the G20 starting to signal their support for a carbon price. So again, we are seeing really good movement and momentum brewing here. Now, the other thing that we need to mention is underneath sort of the scene setting on the road to COP26 is that it's not just about the political ambition, where you'll see this reference to non-state actor ambition and action. And just to be clear, a non-state actor is anyone other than those who are as part of the quote unquote conference of parties, so the parties. So these are the non-party actors, which include governments, other forms of institution or NGO organizations. And I think that's where, again, we're seeing a massive movement of ambition really stepping up. And I think the key here is recognizing there has been a huge wave of really important commitments, But as Mary said, we need to make sure those commitments are absolutely transitioned into action and implementation very, very quickly. But I think many of you on the line, especially if you've engaged either in leading sustainable corporations or the Oxford Climate Emergency Program, will be familiar with concepts relating to net zero. And one of the frames of this is, net zero has gone from being like an extreme thing to actually now absolutely mainstream. Some of the recent data that has come from the Race to Zero team, which is part of the non-state actor contingent that is part of COP26. The data we have now is within the Race to Zero, there are 4,470 businesses, 799 cities, 220 investors, 35 regions, 731 educational institutions, and 46 healthcare institutions that have committed to having their emissions and delivering net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. So again, from what was sort of a fairly sort of newish area around net zero has really blasted off in the last sort of year, I'd say since COP25. And these are sort of quite extraordinary numbers. Now, in addition to the Race to Zero, some of you may also be familiar on the importance of really looking at resilience. And there is a sister campaign to Race to Zero, which is called the Race to Resilience. That's where 25 partners with over 2,000 initiatives in 100 plus countries are building resilience in areas that are vulnerable to climate risk. So again, these are really exciting reflections that showing not only are we seeing the political ambition rising, but we're seeing, again, the non-state actors really getting involved. Some of you may also have picked up that this COP26 is really being seen as one where the importance of the finance community is becoming super, super important. And I would flag people to check out what's called the GFANZ, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. There we are seeing more and more financial organizations making sure they are aligning with net zero emissions. And there's sort of some pretty extraordinary numbers coming through in this space. I'm going to sort of keep on going here. I know I see there's a lot of comments coming here in the chat. We will try and make sure we can send this material for you. Most of this would be available on the Race to Zero website if you want to see these exact numbers. I think what I really just want to do is really underpin that this is a really quick moving and ambition growing movement of organizations of many different shapes and forms. The last piece here on setting the scene on the road to COP26 is really recognizing the economic side. And I think there's so many different ways we could approach this, but the piece that I think was important for everyone to have in mind is that the amount of capital that is moving and coming into this space is extraordinary. So I've picked up that capital committed to net zero has increased from $5 trillion to 90 trillion US dollars within the span of the UK, assuming the COP presidency. So that's 18 months ago. And that's some data that's coming from this Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero. So again, it's not just the ambition and action, but actually what we're seeing is the money coming alongside to enable this. All right. Well, that took me almost 10 minutes to just do one of the slides, Mary. I'm going to apologize because I think I might need a little bit more time to go through the other 2 slides in our 3-slide review of COP26 briefing.
Go for it. Go for it. I think it's really important, and the questions are coming in, and these are really complex issues. And actually, I think what you were able to do is just distill it in a way that becomes actionable. So go for it, by all means.
Okay. Well, we will make sure I want to make sure we get that proper time for your reflections on this, Mary. But maybe we can go to the next slide, if that's possible. Yeah, there we go. Just trying to work out my PowerPoint skills to find the right ways of telling the story. If we were to summarize what the vision of COP26 is in sort of 3 chapters. And again, this is sort of, coming directly from the people that are working within the COP26 framing in the Climate Champions team. But I think the summary of what we really want to see is a recognition that we need to keep this focus on 1.5 degrees. And that is going to be really, really quite critical. And that requires sort of collaboration amongst these different actors, both state and non-state actors. So let's just be clear that this is about having emissions in the next 9 years, which is part of what the commitment is to this of where we need to go when it comes to really addressing what's needed for this 1.5 degree target. What we'll also be seeing, I think, is sectoral breakthroughs across the real economy. And so that's where, again, action is going to be really critical. So what we're going to start seeing and want to see more of, I think, is the real demonstration of those who are actually, converting their commitments into tangible progressive action along the breakthroughs. And so again, COP26 will be a moment where I think what we'll be seeing and having a light shine on is where and how this is coming alive, and where and how organizations are really taking action to get to this 1.5 degrees Celsius commitment that we know is part of the Paris Agreement. Another piece of the framing, just so people are aware, is the narrative that is Glasgow is not the conclusion, but is really being framed as the springboard, a springboard to the era of implementation. So again, these are the sorts of threads you're going to hear and pick up a lot, and they are deeply meaningful. I think it is critically important that we still continue to see commitments made, but this has got to be about action and implementation. So I'd ask everybody to keep their eye very closely on the stories, the examples, and the lessons and the learning that we can take away from these actions that are being taken. The second piece here about resilience and solidarity is really important. So I think the recognition is that we need to make sure we're fostering inclusion as a global movement with absolute solidarity to those who have less access, more vulnerable voices, and making sure we find ways to amplify their voice so that they can be heard. So again, inclusion is going to be a critical thing for COP26, as is this, again, clear focus on building climate resilience for 4 billion of the most vulnerable rural and coastal and urban communities. And again, we'll see that really showing up in the stories and the ambitions that are going to be flagged as part of the race to resilience. So I think that's an important thing. And if people want to know more about resilience, solidarity, and increasingly the framing of climate justice, I'll just give a little plug that in partnership with the School Center for Social Entrepreneurship, B-Lab, the Climate Champions team connected to Race to Zero, Provoke, as well as a range of other partners, put together earlier this year a climate justice playbook for business. And again, what it tells is the stories of organizations that are deeply centering their climate action in principles of climate justice. So for those of you who want to really engage and lean in to this critical importance of, again, resilience and solidarity and climate justice, I would encourage people to take a look at that playbook. It's a version 1, and I hope we'll be working on a version 2 very, very soon. All right, and the third area here that I think is an important part of the vision for COP26, again, really comes down to finance. And out of the corner of my eye, I've seen a few things coming in the chat with a real sort of focus on recognizing the importance of finance. Now, this really is critical, right? And so some of you will have seen the sort of number of $100 billion that's been, part of the commitment by governments in order to be a part of this transition, but really it's going to be trillions that are needed to really transform some of the developing countries and those that are emerging, as well as the advanced economies. So again, I think really it's going to be important for us to recognize and almost harness the skills, the expertise of those in the finance industry, because ultimately this transition is going to have a really important capital need, and we need to find the ways to do that in, again, a safe and a just way. And that kind of connects to the 2 earlier points there. All right, last slide from me. Oh, sorry,
Can
Mary.
I just jump in? Is that okay? So I saw a question come through from David Harmon. So hi, David. Great to see you again. And it's a really important question because it builds on the first question around keeping 1.5 alive. And his question is there not a thread to change legislation and regulation, which is required by governments? And I just wanted to pick up on that and say, around keeping 1.5 alive, that is sort of a lot of the nitty gritty of what that means. And so just to draw that a little bit in more specificity, Shar, if you wanted to speak a little bit more about what it means, keeping 1.5 alive, just a little bit more on that, if that's possible, specifically with the idea that, this is governments who are being asked to make commitments.
Yeah. Well, and I think that comes down to what sort of legislation and policies our government's going to be putting into place. And Mary, you and I have many things that link our work, including, obviously our connection to these important programs at the Side Business School, but also through the B Corp movement, where, a recognition that what we really need to do is to change the rules of the game when it comes to these sort of systemic moments. And that is where policymakers can have a really important role. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the Better Business Act as an example. Here in the UK, where there's a coalition, I think of over 700 businesses now, Mary, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
that have come together to really encourage a change to Section 172 of the company law here in the UK. And that is to make it absolutely clear that the director's duties and the role of directors is to advance the benefits for shareholders and stakeholders. And we can go through a little bit more of the key principles of this sort of proposed amendment to Section 172. But the way this connects to your question, David, is that it's recognizing that actually, if companies are going to go through the mega transformations that are required to meet these targets, then they absolutely need to be enabled with the rules of the game. And that requires them to be able to take investment decisions that have a longer time horizon and deeper consideration of a range of stakeholders. So I hope I'm capturing the spirit of that question, and apologies, I haven't seen the exact wording of it, but I would say it is critically important for governments to engage in creating the enabling conditions that allow businesses to truly step up and, unlock the ingenuity, the innovation that we know will be needed to create the solutions in order to get us to this 1.5 degrees. But Mary, have I answered the question the way it was?
100%. I mean, I'll let David jump in the chat along with many others. It's a really dynamic conversation that's happening over there. But I did share, just for the team to know, I did just put the link to the Better Business Act in the UK into the chat so that the team can feed that back to those who are with us and hopefully include it as one of the resources to accompany this event for those who aren't able to join live. So on to the third slide, Shar, go for it. Thanks for bringing that in.
Great. And I'll just, before we move into the next section, I will just say the TCFD is another really important piece here. So those of you who are working in finance or have a sense of the importance of disclosure, definitely look at that. That's another really important lever that policymakers can make. And I realize we've got a bit of a UK centricity in talking about the Better Business Act here. And I appreciate there's probably people calling in from around the world. But I sense that this is going to be a movement that will be global. We're hoping we started here in the UK, but actually there is a precedent in other regions around the world where this has been an optional or voluntary change that can be made. And there's a range of jurisdictions that have enabled that. But what we really believe is this needs to be mandatory. And our hope is that that's something that will be, if we can, when we pass it in the UK, really important, when we pass it in the UK, it'll be something that we will then see other regions around the world adopt, hopefully quite quickly. But great question. And I really think it underpins, again, this importance of recognizing the connection between state actors and non-state actors. And I think that's the systems change that we'll really need to see move forward at COP26. So how we implement and act together. Okay, Mary, I'm so excited to hear your reflections. So I am just going to go through this last slide quite quickly, actually, because what it is simply a summary of the things that we need to be aware of that will be part of the success, the vision of success, but also the things we need to recognize could be challenges to the success. So this is sort of an eyes wide open on making sure we're all familiar of where some of the barriers and challenges could be. But to really, support the delivery of a successful COP26, I think the sense is we just really need to be clear in defining the direction of travel and setting reasonable expectations for that success, number one. Number two is to really, again, connects to the 1.5, stay alive, 1.5 degrees Celsius is protect and strengthen the credibility of the Paris process internationally. And I would just sort of add to that, it is, again, about showing the activation and the implementation around the commitments that have been made. The last one is about amplifying the story of the non-state actor ambitions. This is about creating these loops where recognizing that when you get non-state actors really sort of supporting this and driving this with action, we then drive into sort of a more systems change space. And that can, again, encourage this ambition loop and put pressure on the negotiators that are going to be working in Glasgow. So again, this connection between state and non-state actor, we just figure out how we have to keep that ambition loop going higher and higher, recognizing where we started with, which is the huge urgency that the IPCC report signaled. Now, the challenges that we really just have to, again, be aware of and be prepared for is we have to really work hard to avoid this narrowing and a reductive focus on what constitutes success. And there's a whole bunch of things we can go into, around the $100 billion or Article 6, but it really is a recognition that we need to keep this really quite broad and holistic and recognizing these systems are interconnected. And so we have to look at the ways the solutions can be too. There's also a view of commitment fatigue that could convert into skepticism about the major deliverables coming from both state and non-state actors. So again, we need to make sure that this skepticism is countered by having the actions, by having the implementation ready to go. There's also a thing here about a mood change. And that mood change could come about in media or in editorial spaces where things turn cynical. And there's a view that, this could be, we're focusing on too many of the shortcomings, despite there being momentum and success. And I think, new climate data that's coming in is going to be an important backdrop for this. So we do need to make sure we are aware that there could be a view that, there's almost a negative media narrative around it being rhetoric or actionless Glasgow that could sort of stymie or soften the real sort of momentum and ambition is out there. So I think I'm not going to sort of give anyone any advice on how to handle these challenges, but I would just say these are things that that I know we have to have on the radar. And be aware of when it comes to really sort of creating the conditions where we can have as successful a COP as possible. All right, I'm going to take a bit of a breath and have a glass of water because I realize I've just talked very quickly for not 10 minutes, but more like 20. But Mary, I think this is a great opportunity to turn it over to you. I mean, we've gone through a lot of things. We've covered a lot of ground in terms of, what we can expect, what sort of some of the priorities are. Love to open it up to you for your reflections on what you've heard and why you think some of this material is important for, again, the non-state actors who are, engaging in this system.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you so much. And I think, when we hear a word like non-state actors, it can make our eyes glaze over, right? But what do we mean when we talk about non-state actors? Non-state actors are the people who are on this call today. So it's the individuals, it's the leaders, it's the executives, it's the managers, it's the investors, it's the consumers. It's those who are consuming media and making decisions about where they buy, how they buy, and who they work for. And that's really come clear to me as we've just had this experience as a school over the past year plus, really stepping into this space with a whole suite of both research and teaching materials, but specifically the ones that Shar and I know most closely are the cohorts around two programs, which is Leading Sustainable Corporations and the Oxford Climate Emergency Program. And these are our deep dives. They're very intense. They're very short. They're meant to be accessible for those who are in a day job that doesn't allow them necessarily to take full time out of school. And why is this important? And why does it link to what Shar has been saying? It's because in order to bring the kind of change that is needed in the COP26 processes, it is going to take a wide range of actors and a wide range of committed individuals and teams and organizations. And it will take leadership. And as Shar often likes to remind us, it will take courage. And so I'll link back to the book that I suggested at the very beginning, because you've dialed into an Oxford University session here. You have to walk away with a good book recommendation that's at least a few decades old. But what do we learn from this book that I mentioned at the very start? This question about how does something like climate, like the environmental crises that we face, like the question around natural resources and biodiversity loss, how do these issues move from something that feels perhaps distant from business or something that business would not necessarily have a leading role on, or would be able to operate as if these issues are not becoming more and more urgent or already have become so? How does it then move front and center? And I think what we learn from research is that there is a context in which all of these interactions happen. And in the same way, what I wanted to talk about today in a bit more detail is just to zoom out and think about the context in which COP26 is happening. So we know very clearly that there are market forces, there are social forces, and there are political pressures that drive companies to respond or not to respond to environmental concerns and to social concerns for that matter. There are cultural frames that enable or prevent leaders from being able to build a strategy that they are able to share with their teams, get buy-in for. And there's a kind of plausibility structure, if you will, a kind of way that something can be delivered that either lands well and is taken on to implementation, or something that simply sits and is not taken forward. And I think that's what we really feel the most excited about with this webinar and with the other work that we're doing, is to say, how do we equip leaders, managers, investors, customers with the tools that are required to help them to build those plausibility structures in their spheres of influence, right? And within this stakeholders with whom they have interactions. So this is what I wanted to share. And this is a lot of the why for us. And I wanted to also pull back and say, you know, with all of the energy and all of the excitement and all of the kind of urgency that I think we feel, and that many of our participants across these programs and those who are joining us online, that we feel there is a context of, again, social, market, and political kind of confluence of realities that are, I think, combining to create what I think are four paradoxes, if you will, that are a kind of the water in which the COP26 processes are swimming, right? And so I think it's really important, if you are a business leader, if you are coming into this conversation thinking, where do I fit into this? There's a few paradoxes that I want to signal around where the broader conversation around sustainability and climate is at the moment that I think are coming down the pike. And in order to lead well right now, it's really important to be able to be aware of those, to be able to recognize them, and to be able to have a bit of a self-reflection for your own leadership role to say, where am I perhaps involved in some of these areas, and how would these tensions relate? So first paradox, I'll just throw your way as a kind of context setting for what else is happening in the world as the COP26 processes exist, not in a vacuum, is that there's this growing demand, and actually the data that is necessary to meet the demand for increased transparency on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you have a very, very significant growth in private markets. So this is a paradox in the sense that you have what I call on the one hand, acute transparency. So high number of ESG and other kinds of reporting frameworks that are proliferating all across the market. This is leading us to know more and more and more about companies that are public and listed and that allow us to scrutinize their activities in greater detail. At the same time, we've seen an enormous shift, even in the last 18 months, of companies, for example, moving assets that might be polluting assets, for example, fossil fuel, off of their so into private markets, so moving them off of their assets and actually saying, let's get this sort of out of our realm of work and into another space, and you know that may be very beneficial for that particular company. But what the concern is, and I think this is where it's very important to have an eye to this paradox, because it is happening at the same time. We're having increased transparency, acute transparency on the one hand. At the same time, you have an increasing lack of transparency and a loss of visibility of what is happening to companies and to assets that are then going into completely private hands. So this is something that I think we need to just face with really clear eyes around. This is the context that's happening across the globe, particularly with some of the more polluting industries. The second paradox is this paradox that I think as we've been in the teaching role in these programs, I hear this again and again and again from leaders and managers who are coming through our teaching programs, who are saying, on the one hand, we know that many of much of the progress that we need to see on climate and much of what we need to see on companies' ability to actually meet their climate commitments will be data driven. So on the one hand, you have a future that really will be data driven without doubt. And we have really, really interesting new kinds of data, new kinds of metrics, new kinds of, for example, ways of understanding impact. And, you know, companies, for example, like True Value Labs, who are looking at web scrapes of how not just companies self-report, but how, for example, NGOs and media are reporting about a company and putting that together for a kind of composite reputational score. So really interesting ways of seeing away from a company's own reporting, how is the world perceiving what a company might be doing, right? So this is data driven. This is a huge place for innovation and for transformation over time. Data is essential to understanding if companies are delivering on their commitments and where and how. But I think there is a challenge that we see again and again with participants, which is data drowning. This idea that, you know, there are more than 300 sort of recognized ESG metrics providers, for example, not all of them actually correlate very well at all with each other in terms of outcomes. That's not necessarily a problem, but it does mean that building strategy on these issues is very complex and very difficult. So I think this data-driven versus data drowning is really a tension that leaders face right now. And depending on your industry, the answer may be more data, the answer may be better data, Or the answer may be, for example, increased collaboration. So one thing to keep an eye on is an initiative that kicked off across 2020 with the IFRS Foundation. This is the foundation that looks at international financial reporting standards, who have developed more and more interest in this question around, should there be in some way a universal set of metrics or a global set of metrics, if you will, on reporting, right? So that we would be able to very clearly have a common language. And I think what's powerful about the carbon discussion is, in some ways the common language is there, but there's still a lot of nuance and a lot of need to cut through the noise. So that's the second paradox that I think makes leading in this space quite difficult, but it means that if you can keep your eye on it, that it's something to build on and to be able to develop a lens to identify when you're being data-driven versus perhaps drowning in data that's not useful to the decisions you need to make. The third paradox that I notice in terms of where the corporate space, the non-state actor, if you will, space is going in light of not just what's happening at COP26, but broader concerns around the role of corporations in society in a world that has just gone through and is still suffering immensely because of a pandemic, is this tension between, or paradox between, on the one hand, an increasing number of corporate stretch goals. So companies who are really being very public in their commitments, whether that's to net zero, whether that's to a specific set of outcomes in terms of their environmental impact. Many of these stretch goals are around carbon. So this is why they're specifically of interest and important for our view of the COP26 process. There's these corporate stretch goals. But what we're also seeing at the same time, and this is the paradox, is increased legal and regulatory skepticism of companies' claims. And this is absolutely urgent and absolutely fundamental for any leader who's, at the one hand, realizing they're being invited to the table in a really profound way to get aligned to delivering on the kinds of commitments that we need to make the outcomes that we need from COP become reality. But there have been increasing numbers, both in jurisdictions all across the world, actually, of whether it's national governments or legal frameworks in different jurisdictions, really querying companies and saying, how do I know that what you're doing is not greenwashing, right? So as we all sort of see companies rush to do these great corporate claims, which we want to encourage and we want to support, there's a note of caution there is an increasing awareness and cynicism, and some of it, very well founded, simply a need to demonstrate progress and demonstrate action. So the paradox there is those corporate stretch goals that we see coming out versus increasing skepticism from legal and regulatory frameworks. So that's the third one. And then the fourth paradox that I've identified, and this is a little, this is, I think, important actually, as we go into this conversation around COP26, because on the one hand, we have carbon urgency, which is absolutely present and existential in the truest sense of the word. We also have beyond carbon. So we have at the same time an enormous need to tackle the challenge that we have created, all of us collectively, around carbon and around climate change. At the same time, if you will, the E, the environment, also has the S, the social, and the G, the governance piece in the ESG acronym that we all hear so much about. So when we think about beyond carbon, we think about some of the justice issues that Char was speaking about. We think about social issues. We think about gender inclusion. We think about marginalization. We think about human and political rights. So these are areas that, at the same time as the conversation is moving towards business understanding, in many cases, greater urgency around carbon, there's carbon urgency, and at the same time, businesses are being asked and will be asked to step up on issues that are beyond carbon, if you will. And so I think that paradox is perhaps the toughest, in the sense that it's asking leaders to take a stand, if you will, or become aware or become comfortable or confident, or also admit when they perhaps have areas of doubt or need to have perhaps a community approach to understanding an issue that no single company can get their arms around just on their own, and really saying, how do we actually become part of a community that builds, the kind of business community and the kind of society that we would all be secure and proud and happy to live in, and have our grandchildren do the same, for example. So I'll just mostly leave there, other than that I thought, it's always good when you're on a webinar to have a drink. This is my chosen cup for today. So it was the signal for the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention held in the United States in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. And this is the meeting that launched the women's suffrage movement in the United States. And about 7 decades later, this resulted in women in the United States having the full right to vote. So I just named this as something that gives us, at the one side, the urgency that comes with the need to convene decision makers, the need to name issues that have been perhaps not addressed properly by leadership, and the need to do this over the long haul in coordinated community and really be committed to the issues over the long term. And I raise it now because it's also a good reminder that there's carbon urgency, but there's also beyond carbon, because a great many issues in this area have gone backwards and not forwards in the last 18 months in our world. And so I just want to leave that as a kind of encouragement for all of us to say things can change, but it takes time and it takes commitment. And we hope that if there's a small part we can play together with you and as Oxford, we want to do that. So thanks so much.
Oh, Mary, I mean, you're getting a lot of love for your cup. And I have to say, I'm sorry if you catch my eyes looking around, it's because I actually have a very nice sort of green backwards behind me. But as Mary knows, in front of me, I have a bulletin board that is full of all sorts of things. And actually, one of the images that I have in front of me is similarly a reflection of the power of movements and in community and working in community. And so I have a visual representation of the suffragettes movement that I kind of look at in front of me that feels really important in this moment. So thank you, Mary. And thank you for that extraordinary framework of thinking about these things in paradoxes. I feel like this is an incredibly complicated time. And I think you've articulated so brilliantly where and how this complication is coming up from when we have these different forces in play. And I know you and I've chatted a little bit about, using paradox as a framing. There is some interesting writing by another colleague of ours at Oxford around how to address a paradox. And I know we've used it in some of our teaching before, but Andrew White, if I'm remembering his reaction to paradox properly, he says, first you have to accept the paradox, then you can confront it, and then you can transcend it. And I think what you've done for us here, Mary, has helped us really get to those first 2 stages, right? Identifying and seeing where it is, confronting it and being able to understand it. And I think providing sort of the energy now of how we go about transcending these paradoxes. So Mary, thank you very much. And now I think I'm going to just share. Oh, sorry, Mary, do you want to jump in?
Just one thing to jump in there, and I think it's been really evident to me and I think Shar, you would probably say the same, as we've spent time, particularly with the programs that you and I have directed across the last, year plus, if you will. It's really struck me the sense that, often leaders, investors, individuals, just humans, I think, feel an enormous sense of burden at the moment of saying, what can I do? And if you are in a very senior leadership position, what can my company do? What can my set of investments do? And I think I have seen people feel that they are often in a place where they need to come up with the answers, perhaps all on their own, and come with a perfect plan. And I would say, the invitation here is simply to join the conversation and join the conversation with others. Because we are actually living in a world that is a post-industrial world that was built on fossil fuel, and this touches every single one of our lives in every single way that we move from here to there, what we eat, and the clothes that we wear. This is something that the depth of change is so massive that I guess I want to just give a word of in a way, encouragement to say, if you don't feel like your company has it all together, it's really no surprise. It'd be quite shocking if you did, given the context in which you sit. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a part to play. Find others and do that in community, ideally even within your industry. So I think the power within industry that we've seen, I'm thinking of one of our past participants who's in the construction industry in a country across the globe, and post the program, he's really taken a leadership role. And been very active in his industry association. And those things, I think, is where, those spaces are really important. And so I just wanted to say that this is Shar and I wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review less than a year ago now about this idea that there's going to be some heroic CEO that will at some point come in and change business and tell us all that everything is okay. This is not going to happen, and I think it can be deeply freeing to say to those who are in leadership positions, there are no heroes. What there is community working together for change.
So beautifully put, Mary. And I think that is it. I mean, the issues that we need to tackle at a systems level are interconnected, and therefore the key here is going to be how we do collaborate with one another. And that can happen at an industry level. It happens within organizations. It happens within families and communities. So I think if there's one thing people take away is just this idea of finding community to work alongside, to learn with, to share with, to find hope with, and to find support to move forward, knowing that we are in a remarkable moment in history. So I think, again, collaboration, community, coalition building is so key. This actually picks up on, I think, some of the questions that have come up through the chat. But actually, before we go into sort of a few final comments on some of the questions, I wonder if maybe we can move just quickly to the next slide. And it sort of links to what you've been chatting about here, Mary, in terms of finding community. Maybe the next slide. There we go. Next one after that, actually. Great. Something else that you should keep an eye on as we get closer to Glasgow is what the role of movements and citizens and engagement could look like. I will sort of, with full disclosure, put my hand up and say, in addition to my role at Oxford, I have a role within B-Lab UK as an activist in residence. And that's partially because I am really interested in where and how new power and old power is meeting, because ultimately we need both and to really address the systems changes. So I encourage people to keep an eye on not just what's happening inside COP26, but also some of the things that are happening around it. So November 6th, Saturday, expecting to have quite a few people on the streets in Glasgow. It'll be interesting to see the messages and the sense of community and the key narratives that are coming up from the movement of citizens and what citizens are marching for and engaging in. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. The other thing I'll just flag really quite quickly, and this is a piece written by Rupert Reed, who has an association with Greens Can, but also he's a professor at East Anglian University. He's put together a list of what he calls the 10 tests for COP26. So he's trying to say, here are the things that we really need to get met as part of this COP26 process. And I won't go through all 10 of them, but if people are interested in reviewing them, you can see them online. But reason why I wanted to share them is because it is important to sort of, I think, have, again, in the spirit of ambition and urgency, a real connection between what's happening within the COP26 process and then, where and how there's pressure in order to make organizations, make institutions, really move at the urgency and the speed with the ambition that's needed. So next slide, please. There's just a few headlines of some of the things that are in that sort of 10 tests for COP26, which, actually speak to some of the things we've talked about today. So it is about investment, and it's about renewable energy, shifting in transportation systems, including aviation. Really interesting, this piece about the transfer of technology and funding to global South countries, really recognizing the importance of planetary boundaries. And I would just flag another Oxford colleague, Kate Rayworth, and her work around donut economics. Actually, this is great because it's picking up on some of the themes that you've all brought in here as well. The legal requirement, for example, to disclose climate-related financial risks in financial accounts. And then, of course, really clear reduction of industrial and intensive agriculture, knowing the contributions that makes to our global missions. So again, those are just a few points that are in this top 10 list, but those of you who are interested, maybe we can pop a link to that in the chat as well. But my friends, we are nearing the end of our time, and one of our commitments to you was to sort of share a few thoughts on what you could do if you want to be a part of these COP26 programs. How can you engage? And we have two things for you to keep in mind as we get closer to these meetings that start on November 1st. Next slide, please. Yes, because you are the change. We are the change, actually. We together are the change. Next slide. Here we go. So one thing that we're involved in is a series of what's being called future labs that are taking place in the Blue Zone at COP26. And the Blue Zone is where sort of the negotiations happen. The two high-level champions, Gonzalo Muniz and Nigel Topping, have really been captured by this idea that there are pockets of the future already around us right now. We can see in the spaces we operate in right now that where the sort of the seeds of the change exist. Another quote from a popular science fiction author, William Gibson, is, "The future is already here. It just isn't evenly distributed." So these future labs are going to be happening over the course of COP26. They're going to be on the themes of future of law, the future of governance. It's the one that I'm involved in, so I'll do a little plug on that one for November 8th. Transformative economics, and it picks up on one of the points that came through, I think, in the chat. That's where we might see more on regenerative and circular economy, carbon removals, climate smart healthcare, and just climate action. So again, in the spirit of climate justice. So these are 6 futures labs that they will be broadcast. So what we will be getting is a YouTube link and a YouTube channel. Definitely look it up as part of your COP26, viewing pleasure. But there will be some fascinating conversations, again, which are highlighting where are there things already happening today that are signals and signs of what we need to radically scale up in order to meet these targets. So that's a really clear way. If those of you are interested in tuning into those conversations, there might be some virtual ways to engage as well. Definitely keep your eye on it. And again, the framing of this is exploring the bold and really imaginative ideas for the systems level change that we know are going to be needed. And again, the framing is a transition to a regenerative and just world. So that's one way you can engage. The second way you can engage, and if I go to the next slide, there we go, is imagining what your boardroom could look like in 2030. And I'll actually just ask to go to the next slide, actually 2 slides down if that, just stop there actually. Oh, back one, back one. We'll just stop on this one because I know we're at time. But this is an initiative that is being incubated within B-Lab UK, but actually we are working with a range of partners from the GARP, which is the group of accredited risk professionals, to the IOD, which is the Institute of Directors, to the Capitals Coalition, to Make My Money Matter. I mean, we just are working with a true dream team of organizations to encourage businesses around the world during COP26 to have a board meeting as if it were in 2030, and use it as a way to really think about in 2030, who is going to be around your boardroom table. I saw a question come up here about who speaks for non-humans at COP26. Well, these board meeting sessions are a way for you to imagine who speaks for non-humans in a boardroom session. Do you have a representation of the ocean or the environment in some way around your boardroom table? So this is a chance for you to find a way to really stretch to think about who will be around the table in 2030 that will be making the big decisions for your organization. It's also about where that meeting is happening. Is it in a traditional boardroom setting, or is it on a surfboard, or in forests, or in schools? Thinking about what is on the agenda, what sort of decisions are going to need to be made in 2030 based on where your organization is right now, how those decisions are made. Maybe you're using citizen panels and citizens assemblies to bring in the voices of a range of people that wouldn't otherwise have a voice around the boardroom table. And also, and this speaks to sort of something that we sort of already spoken about, Mary, about the what rules need to be followed. So what will be fiduciary duty in 2030? What will be reporting requirements? So again, if those of you who are interested in doing something in your own organization to be a part of this moment and want to do more than just necessarily tune in to the sort of the presentations at COP26, would really consider finding a way within your organization to animate a conversation. And again, if you want any tools or resources, if you want to just go to the next slide, we have an activation kit that has been put together that has some great tools and resources. But I think that we have got only a couple of minutes left, and I know a ton of questions that have come in. Now, Mary, while you were going through your 4 paradoxes, I tried to capture a few things. So maybe I'll just do a quick reflection and try and pick up on a few of the points, and then maybe turn it over to you for a closing remark. But one of the questions that came in with nature-based solutions, yes, that's certainly going to be a key theme at COP26, and I would encourage people to check out at Oxford the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, where there is a range of excellent case studies, and I think we will see a lot more of those coming through the process. Alifia, you asked about examples. Part of the Race to Zero is collecting the stories of action and implementation, and those will be published. So keep your eyes out for those, because I think that will give you some really good examples of those businesses that are taking action. Yelma, you talked about large companies and what they can do. We've certainly addressed this thing about changing your articles, making it super clear what you are in the business of doing, and thinking about fiduciary duty, and making it explicit that it must be to, advance benefits for shareholders and stakeholders. But another thing that's interesting that large multinationals can really do is be a part of this investment conversation. So the amount of cash equivalents, and short-term investments that might be on your balance sheet, thinking about ways that you can be investing in the radical solutions that we know are going to be necessary. So innovation investment is going to be super important. We already talked about the who speaks for the non-humans. There's so many other great things. David, you talked about Future Fit, big fan. Cedric, you mentioned entreprise à mission, which is the French law, which is already, again, as you've mentioned, on the path around really creating the conditions at a voluntary legislative level to help companies do this work. And I just wanted to say thank you to the person who posted the Eventbrite for the IPCC session later on today that's happening at Oxford. I would encourage you to tune in, specifically if you have questions or comments that you want to engage on with some of the people that are deeply, deeply involved in the climate science at the IPCC. The Oxford Net Zero Network is also a great place to go, and that website is available. Well, what a power hour. Mary, do you want to close us out with any closing last comments before we say goodbye to everybody?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad to do that. And I think I'm going to pick up on a point that Tatiana, hi Tatiana, it's great to see you again. Tatiana was in an earlier cohort of Leading Sustainable Corporations. She's based in Brazil, and she's asked, I think, a question that's really probably on many people's minds, which is there a paradox between the scale of the task before us and the fact that we are all flawed and limited and creaturely little humans trying to do our best in this very big system. So I think this question around burnout and how do you find your space and how do you continue to lead when the issue seems so and is so insurmountable by any one person or even any one very powerful corporation. So I wanted to just close with a good friend of mine who's spent a lot of time thinking about this central question, which is how do we live in a way that reflects what we believe? And his name is Steve Garber, and he's written a lot pulling on sociology and a wide range of different vocational authors from across the sphere, really. And he's identified essentially that for you to consistently live in a way that reflects what you believe over time, things you might want to consider are having someone that you look up to in this area that you regularly check in with, so that inspirer figure. And I think that's something that all of us can use as we lead in these areas or seek to. And then having people around you, having those next to you who will support you, because there will be times when any leader is past what they can give on these issues. And so I think the main takeaway from his work is really don't go it alone. And I think that's right, because all of this, like you said, when we talk about non-state actors, fundamentally we're talking about humans, and we're talking about humans when we talk about the state actors too, but they get constrained by all kinds of things that lead to outcomes that nobody wants. So let's leave it there, and thanks so much for joining, and thanks to the team who helped us put this together, and thanks to Shar for all the work that you're doing as well.
Well, let me come off mute to say a giant thank you to you, Mary, and to thank everybody who's here and joined us today, and those who are listening to the recording. We have captured all the questions that are here, and we will try our best to sort of find a way to reflect on them, maybe in a blog that we will put together with some of the other questions. So I just want to say thank you all for your engagement, for your interest, and let's hit the road. COP26. We'll see you in Glasgow, either virtually, or if you're going to be there, definitely look us up. Thanks, everybody. And again, thanks to the team who made all of this possible today. Have a wonderful Monday morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever in the world you are today.
Thanks so much.
Ryan, are you there?
Yes, hi, Brim.
You just want to say a few things about the program?
Yes, for those that are still on the call, just a reminder that both our Oxford Climate Emergency and Leading Sustainable Corporation programs are beginning shortly this month. The Climate Emergency program begins on Wednesday, and the Leading Sustainable Corporations program begins later in the month. I've popped my contact details in the chat, so if anybody would like some more information about either of those programs, please reach out to me and give me a call, and I look forward to hearing from you.